Good evening. I'm Dale Newman, Director of the Harry S. Truman Center for Government Affairs at UMKC, and I want to welcome you to this, the 8th lecture and 13th Public Affairs program in our Truman Legacy Public Affairs series that began in November of 2007. I want to thank the Truman Presidential Library and Museum and the UMKC Bernard and Haskell Lecture Fund for their financial support for this evening's program. I also want to thank the Kauffman Foundation for making the venue available and their able staff for all of their assistance. I also need to mention two other women who have helped make tonight's event possible. Dr. Karen Vorst, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at UMKC, who encouraged me in 2006 to take on the challenge of the then UMKC Chancellor to make something happen in the name of Truman at UMKC, and we have tried. And Miss Gayla Curtis. Gayla, some folks may need to visit with you at the end of the evening. I understand you have to sign some things to prove that they were here. Gayla Curtis, my Truman Center administrative assistant, who gets all the detail work done in good order for us to hold events such as this. And then Ray Geselbach is here from the Presidential Museum and Library, one of our co-sponsors and partners on a number of events. Our guest tonight is Dr. George C. Edwards III. He's the Distinguished Professor of Political Science at Texas A&M University. He also holds the George and Julia Blucher Jordan Chair in Presidential Studies and has served as the Olin Professor of American Government at Oxford, the John Adams Fellow at the University of London, and has held senior visiting appointments at Sciences Po Paris, Peking University, Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and the United States Military Academy at West Point. He's an associate member of Newfield College at the University of Oxford and was the founder from 1991 to 2001, the director of the Center for Presidential Studies. A leading scholar of the presidency, he has authored dozens of articles and has written or edited 23 books on American politics and public policy making. He is also editor of Presidential Studies Quarterly and general editor of the Oxford Handbook of American Politics series. Among his latest books, On Deaf Ears, The Limits of the Bully Pulpit, he examines the effectiveness of presidential leadership on public opinion. Why the Electoral College is bad for America, evaluates the consequences of that method of electing the president. Governing by Campaigning analyzes the politics of the Bush presidency, and The Strategic President offers a new formulation for understanding presidential leadership. In some of the PR materials we sent out, we said he would be signing copies of The Strategic President. Well, if you brought your copy, he will sign it. If you expected us to have one here to sell you, I was mistaken. We could not do that, but Barnes & Noble has a lot over there in stock. I'm sure they will sell you one. Unfortunately, you will just have to kind of presume that he would have signed it had you had it here with you this evening. Professor Edwards has served as president of the Presidency Research Section of the American Political Science Association, which has named its annual dissertation prize in his honor and awarded him its Career Service Award. A member of Phi Beta Kappa, a Woodrow Wilson Fellow, he has received the Decoration for Distinguished Civilian Service from the United States Army and the Pi Sigma Alpha Prize from the Southern Political Science Association. He's also a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. He has spoken at over 200 universities and other groups in the United States and abroad, keynoted numerous national and international conferences, done hundreds of interviews with the national and international press, and can be heard often on National Public Radio. Grants from the National Science Foundation, the Smith-Richardson Foundation, and the Ford Foundation have funded his work. He has served on the board of directors of the Roper Center, the board of trustees of the Center for the Study of the Presidency, and on editorial boards. Dr. Edwards also applies his scholarship to practical issues of governing, including advising Brazil on its constitution and the operation of its presidency, Russia on building a democratic national party system, Mexico on elections, and Chinese scholars on democracy. He also authored studies for the 1988 and 2000 U.S. presidential transitions. I give you Dr. Edwards, who will visit with us this evening on the topic, Presidential Leadership in Healthcare Reform from Truman to Obama. Dr. Edwards.
Thank you very much. I think we got slightly ahead of the story here, so we'll, yeah, there we go. Okay. In Dale's enthusiasm, he pressed a few buttons. That's okay. I'm delighted to be here and have the opportunity to share some ideas with you. And I especially want to thank Dale Newman for all his good work in arranging my visit. He's been a genial and gracious host. And also Gayla Curtis, who's a delightful and efficient assistant and has expedited every stop of the way. And I also want to thank Dean Karen Vorst for her support of the Truman Center and all of you for coming. Now, particularly, I want to say that I'm also honored to be speaking under the auspices of the Truman Center, because there's no doubt in my mind that Harry Truman richly deserves his status as an American icon. So any association I have with Harry Truman is certainly gratifying to me. Now, I'm a president watcher, and that in itself is not a peculiar distinction. People of all backgrounds have been watching presidents for more than 2 centuries. Henry Adams, the renowned 19th century historian, was a president watcher par excellence. The grandson and the great-grandson of presidents, he observed them from close quarters. In fact, the Hay Adams Hotel across Lafayette Square from the White House stands on the grounds of his former home. Well, as he reflected on the progression of presidents from George Washington through our 18th president, Ulysses S. Grant, he claimed that that progression provided enough evidence to dispute Darwin's theory of evolution. Now, tonight I won't be evaluating individual presidents, but I'll argue that we need to rethink how we understand their core responsibility, the responsibility of leadership. And I want to use healthcare reform as an example of some of the challenges that presidents face. More specifically, I want to use healthcare policy as a vehicle for understanding, or perhaps the most common White House strategy for governing, using the bully pulpit to obtain the public support for policy initiatives. At the same time, there's a dual theme, and I want to use this process of understanding the presidency to understand why we have such a difficult time in reforming health care. I'll try to do so in terms that are specific enough that you can evaluate my argument and perhaps offer your personal assessment. And I certainly look forward to your feedback. Now, obviously, any discussion that deals with politics is fraught with potential partisan implications, and I'll endeavor to be as nonpartisan as possible. Now, of course, partisanship is in the mind of the beholder. This reminds me of one of my favorite stories of 2 opposing political party county chairmen who were sharing a rare moment together. And the Democratic chairman told his Republican counterpart, "You know, I never pass up an opportunity to promote the party. For example, whenever I take a taxi, I give the driver a sizable tip, and when I get out of the cab, I say, vote Democratic." Well, his opponent, the Republican, responded, "Well, I have a better scheme. It's very similar, but it doesn't cost me a nickel." Well, the Democrat was naturally quite curious about this and asked, "Well, what's your scheme?" And the Republican replied, "Well, whenever I take a cab, I don't give the driver any tip at all. And I also say, vote Democratic." Well, I'll try to do slightly better than that and the nonpartisanship. Now, the public's relationship with, the president's relationship with the public is crucial. Gaining and maintaining office, obtaining support from an independently elected legislature, and increasing the party's representation in Congress all depend on public opinion. Can presidents change public opinion and move it in their direction to support their policies, like healthcare policies, or are they likely to be frustrated in their efforts? Now, it's quite interesting that politicos who have a strong incentive for believing in the power of campaigns and who believe in the power of the bully pulpit are the most likely to provide the wrong answer. Partly this is due to misremembered history. When Ronald Reagan's pollster found that the public overwhelmingly disapproved of the administration's reduction in aid to education, Reagan's public relations guru, Michael Deaver, you may recall him, arranged for Reagan to make a series of speeches emphasizing the quality of education. Now, Deaver later gloated to the Wall Street Journal that public opinion about the president on education flip-flopped without any change in policy at all. Now, if public opinion had changed, as Deaver described, it would indeed have been an impressive performance of presidential persuasion. However, it turns out that opinion did not change. How do I know this? Because Richard Worthland, who was Ronald Reagan's pollster and took polls for Reagan throughout his presidency, gave me all the polls. So I know exactly what they saw in the White House. Similarly, in his memoir of the Reagan years, Deaver reports that the president was distressed about the lack of public support for defense spending. According to Deaver, and I'm going to be reading you a quote here, "Reagan pulled me aside one day. "Mike," he said, "these numbers show you're not doing your job. This is your fault. You got to get me out of Washington more so I can talk to people about how important this policy is." So Deaver said, "I did." And he would systematically add his rationale for military spending to nearly every speech. And eventually his message would get through to the American people. In fact, however, public opinion on defense spending did not move in the president's direction in the Reagan administration. Indeed, it moved in the other direction. Now, one doesn't have to challenge the sincerity of Deaver's memory to conclude that such commentary contributes to the misunderstanding of the potential of presidential leadership. Perhaps popular faith in the potential of persuasive leadership persists because such a view simplifies political analysis. Because broader forces that may influence changes in policy are complex, perhaps even intractable, focusing primarily on the individual as leader eases the burden of explaining policy change. Faith in the persuasive presidency also simplifies the evaluation of problems of governing, which we always seem to have. If it's reasonable to expect the White House to create opportunities for change by getting the public on its side, then a failure to do so must be due to a personal deficiency. If problems arise because the leader lacks the proper will or skills or understanding, then the solution to our need for leadership is straightforward and very simple. Let's get a new president. Simplification. Equally striking is the lack of evidence of the persuasive power of the presidency. Observers of both the press and the academy base their claims about the impact of such leadership on little or no systematic evidence and seemingly little reflection. There is no systematic evidence at all that demonstrates that presidents can reliably move others to support them. Anybody, anywhere. There is no systematic evidence. So let's turn to health care, and particularly national health insurance, to dig a bit deeper into the nature of presidential leadership. Now, I'm going to start with Franklin Roosevelt for just a moment. Elected in 1932, in the depths of the Great Depression, he embraced the concept of providing health insurance for all Americans. But he was never willing to put his agenda at risk for the cause. He considered it as part of Social Security, which passed in 1935, one of the landmark pieces of legislation in all of American history. And it originally had national health insurance as part of the bill. But he pulled it. He pulled it out, and he pulled it out because he felt that having it in there might sink the entire package. Now remember, this is in the Depression when only a very small percentage of the public had health insurance. Nevertheless, he thought, I can't do it. I can't do it, and I'll lose Social Security in the process. Well, Harry Truman picked up the mantle from Roosevelt. If anything, he was more committed to the cause of national health insurance, pledging only 4 months after FDR's death to send Congress a plan. Now, in April of 1946, Gallup asked the public what, if anything, should be done to provide for the payment of medical bills. 26% responded, nothing. Only 12% of the people were willing to support what was then termed socialized medicine under Social Security, much of what is now Medicare, a policy like Medicare, except with larger percentage of the population covered. Now, this was very frustrating to Truman. This morning, Ray Gesselbrock of the Truman Library pulled some personal correspondence, and it reiterated a point that Truman makes in his memoirs. He had a real deep personal concern. He was struck by the fact that when we had a broad draft in World War II, and we needed bodies, we needed everybody, full mobilization, a third of the people, even under those crisis situations, a third of young Americans were turned down as being unfit due to their health. That's an astonishingly large percentage of the public. He was worried that women could not afford prenatal care to have healthy children, and that that they certainly couldn't afford, nobody, hardly anybody, could afford an operation. So he felt this very deeply. Back to the polls. When asked what they anticipated would happen to their health care if the government ran a health insurance program, only 32% thought it would be better. You could see the built-in resistance. Well, given this kind of resistance, he didn't push hard for it in 1946. And then the Republicans won the elections, the midterm elections, in 1946 in November, and that doomed chances for congressional action in that Congress. But then he was elected in 1948, as you well know, and he once again proposed national health insurance. Now, in February of 1949, the New York Times predicted, and I quote, "It's doubtful if any other proposal on President Truman's agenda for Congress will whip up quite so great a controversy as this program for national health insurance, for it is the most radical reform yet broached by his administration." Why radical? In essence, the administration bill defines an obligation of government, which has never before been assumed in this country. It transforms medical care from a category of comparative luxury to that of a national resource, available to all the people on the basis of equality, unquote. Now, you might think, given this description, that this would be a very popular goal for everyone to have access to health care, equal access, sort of equal access anyhow. If you thought that, you would be wrong. A Gallup poll in May of 1949 found the public evenly divided and less than a majority in favor. In October, Gallup asked the public again, and the results were discouraging for the White House. Only 55% said they'd heard about the president's plan, and of those who did know about the proposal, only 24% approved. Not good. The president could break through. He could not convince the public to support his policy. Now, you might think a man who had just pulled off one of the biggest upsets in American political history by taking his case directly to the people in the most famous campaign of all time, right, could do so for a policy proposal that would provide millions of people with access to health care that they currently lacked. If you thought that, you would be wrong. Campaigning is not governing. To win an election requires beating one or perhaps two alternatives at a specific time in a contest in which there must be a positive decision. There must be a winner. Somebody has to win the election ultimately. It doesn't require focusing attention on the details of a specific policy initiative, which of course eases the path to attracting a majority if you don't go into details. Enacting policy change requires many victories over a sustained period of time in committees in Congress, on the floor, two houses, etc. And it requires these victories in a context in which no action may be the preferred option, and in which gridlock would be the common result. Moreover, policy debates, unlike elections, often focus on the specifics of proposals, making it more difficult to garner majority support. In his memoirs, Harry Truman wrote this: "I've had some bitter disappointments as president, but the one that has troubled me most in a personal way has been the failure to defeat the organized opposition to a national compulsory health insurance program," unquote. Well, Democrats with this experience shifted their focus to a more modest goal, health care for the elderly, or what would later be known as Medicare. John F. Kennedy championed Medicare during his shortened presidency. John F. Kennedy, supposedly a great communicator, famous for being a communicator, famous for his abilities on television. On May 20th, 1962, the president spoke at a packed rally at Madison Square Garden that was carried by all three major television networks. Very unusual. And shown at 32 other rallies held around the country. Over the next couple of days, there were an additional 12 rallies. But Medicare didn't pass. So Lyndon Johnson finally succeeded, but it took him 2 tries. He nearly got it out of Congress in 1964, but late in the term, it failed. And then after the huge Democratic majorities came in after the 1964 election, he had his victory. And the president came here and signed it with Harry Truman at his side to honor Truman's efforts. "You've made me a very happy man," Truman told Johnson. "I'm glad to have lived this long." Johnson gave Truman the first pen used to sign the Medicare bill. But, of course, that still left millions of Americans without health insurance. Jimmy Carter proposed national health insurance. In recent days, we've heard a bit about this as he blamed Teddy Kennedy, and I'm going to bravely avoid that particular squabble for the moment because it'll be a distraction. So I'm going to move to Bill Clinton, if you will. And he took it up once again, the battle for comprehensive health insurance. In fact, health care reform was to be the centerpiece of the Clinton administration. How do I know this? Because the Clinton administration said so. In September of 1993, and remember, President Clinton became president in 1993, the president delivered a well-received national address before Congress on the need for reform. Yet the president was not able to sustain the support of the public for health care reform. The White House held out against compromise with Republicans and conservative Democrats, hoping for a groundswell of public support, but it never came. As you can see in this table, support was high right after the president spoke, and as you can see, it wasn't long, and this only covers from September until July of the next year when the whole thing just died. The president did worse and worse. In the meantime, of course, the president's proposal opponents launched an aggressive counterattack in what are now the legendary Harry and Louise advertisements, raising concerns, and Americans are very loss-aversive, raising concerns that they would be worse off. So by mid-July, only 40% of the public favored the president's health care reform proposal, and 56% opposed it. The longer the issue lingered, the less the public supported the president. And of course, it never came to a vote in either house of Congress. Now, this doesn't mean it's a good bill or a bad bill, but this is what happened to the bill. Moreover, the whole effort ended disastrously for the Democrats. Republicans won control of both the House and the Senate in the 1974 elections, and I'll have more to say about that at the end of my talk. Clinton's debacle set back the cause for more than a decade, and it was not until 2008 that Democratic candidates once again robustly embraced the concept of universal health care reform. Now, the Obama White House believes in the power of the presidential pulpit. More importantly, it believes the president is an irresistible persuader. According to his top counselor, David Axelrod, and I quote, "I don't think there's been a president since Kennedy whose ability to move issues and people through his speech has been comparable," unquote. This faith in presidential persuasion underlies the administration's decision to try to move a very large agenda simultaneously, and its response to political problems as well. When times get tough, Obama goes public. In the campaign season, you may recall, he confronted the issue of Jeremiah Wright's incendiary comments with an extended address and well-received address on race relations. When the White House encountered resistance to its stimulus program, the president held his first primetime press conference. Rather than attempting to persuade members of Congress individually on his record-breaking fiscal year 2010 budget, he traveled outside Washington, appearing at town hall meetings and news conferences, and also became the first sitting president to appear on late-night talk shows. When support for health care reform was falling, the president delivered a primetime televised address before a joint session of Congress, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. When he decided to send 30,000 additional American troops to Afghanistan, he delivered another primetime address, this time from my old home at West Point. But the biggest legislative battle of the early Obama administration was health care reform. Substantially changing any policy that dealt with 17%, and it is now 17% of the nation's gross domestic product, was going to be difficult. It's huge. Doing so in a context of highly polarized partisan politics, enormous budget deficits, and broad skepticism about government activism only made matters worse for the White House. Nevertheless, the president forged ahead, and he faced stiff competition from the beginning. Republicans had found their voice in opposing his stimulus bill and the budget, and didn't hesitate at all to mobilize against the Democrats' health care proposals. Well, the White House was very aggressive in its public advocacy. The president alone made 52 public addresses or statements specifically on his health care proposal in his first year. That's a lot. The White House arranged with ABC News for a primetime program back in June of 2009, which was entitled Questions for the President, Prescription for America. And then they had a follow-up on Nightline that allowed the president to explain his health care proposal to the president yet again, to the public, yet again. But only 4.7 million viewers tuned in. Now that's a big audience for most of us, but out of 300 million people in America, it's not that many. Moreover, 4.7 that tuned in, well, that's 3 million fewer than a competing repeat of CBS's CSI New York. So you get a sense of the problem the president faces. Well, as we will see, the polls kept getting worse for the administration. So the White House moved its public relations effort into high gear in late July. In the words of the Washington Post, it was all Obama all the time. And we can see in this table what the Post meant. The president is being very active. He said, I'm sensing trouble. We better get out there. So the president's engaging in all these kinds of things. He traveled, made public statements, gave interviews, held town meetings, and a primetime press conference, delivered a radio address, released statements and reports on health care. Moreover, the White House made heavy use of internet video to broadcast the president's message beyond the reach of the traditional media. But nothing seemed to work. Democratic Party officials acknowledged that the growing intensity of opposition to the president's health care plans had caught them off guard and forced them to begin an August counteroffensive after the July counteroffensive. The president and his proxies launched a blitz of town hall meetings, grassroots lobbying, and television advertising designed to rally public support. Now, one aspect of this strategy was towards re-energizing web-savvy allies who had backed Obama in the election. The president appeared on videos on whitehouse.gov, recounting some personal stories about problems that average Americans had. He had a conference call with grassroots supporters hosted by a Democratic organization you may know about called Organizing for America. An estimated 280,000 people dialed in. Well, by mid-August, health care reform was receiving the most attention in the news. It was a story the public was following the most closely, but this was not necessarily an advantage for the White House. Democrats had not anticipated Republicans and their allies hurling incendiary accusations that the Obama plan would empower death panels, help illegal immigrants, and raid Medicare. So following the Labor Day holiday, Obama renewed his public relations offensive yet again. Given the high stakes of passing health care reform and the downturn in public opinion about it, which I will detail for you in a moment, the president turned to what many considered the most powerful weapon in his arsenal, a nationally televised address before a joint session of Congress on September 9th, 2009. And this is quite unusual. You may think it's typical, but it's actually very rare for a president to make a nationally televised address before Congress on an issue, a domestic issue, before Congress. It's actually quite unusual to do. Obama had to reassure progressive activists that he'd not lost his passion for reform, so his speech contained tough talk and denunciations of false or misleading claims, and I'll come back to those in just a minute, that had been made about the legislation. The president knew, of course, there was little possibility of moving Republicans from opposition to support, but he tried to reach the center of the electorate, as any smart coalition builder would be doing. It was this segment of the public that had become worried about the scope and nature of the president's proposal. So much of his rhetoric was designed to provide reassurance and reflected an orientation towards compromise and bipartisanship. Now here we had a big audience, 32.1 million people, but of course only a small fraction of the public, and down from the 52 million people who had heard his February address when he first became president. Now, polls did not find a lasting impact on the speech in either the president's handling of health care or in his support for the plans. Americans' views of how health care reform would alter their health care, the health care of others, their health care insurance coverage and costs, and their ability to obtain health insurance were little changed after the president spoke, and you can compare before and after there. Now this again, I'd like to note, Barack Obama is viewed as a very capable communicator. Indeed, in most instances, their views were slightly more negative after the speech, and pluralities were in the direction of worse off for all the questions except the ability to obtain health care insurance. Now, following his speech, Americans also did not expect health care legislation to improve their personal health care or the overall U.S. health care system in a number of areas, including quality, coverage, cost, and insurance company requirements for procedures to be covered, as you can see in this table. For 7 of the 8 questions in the table, more people predicted health care legislation would make the matters worse than better. Moreover, opinion about the effects of health care became more negative in October. Pretty tough times, and this is the great gun in the arsenal, and one you can't use very often. You can't be using this weapon. Well, he followed his speech with a series of speeches, interviews, and television appearances over the next 2 weeks, and as you can see, and this culminated in an unprecedented set of appearances on 5 Sunday interview shows on the same day. Never before done. Well, the trend and evaluation of the overall effects of health care reform continued to worsen. This table shows that the percentage of the public concluding that health care reform would make them and their families, as well as the country as a whole, worse off, moved against the president. In the months leading up to the final vote on health care reform in 2010, this year, only about 1/3 of the people felt reform would benefit themselves and their families. Again, let me emphasize, this doesn't mean that they were right or they're wrong, but this is what they thought, and that's what counts. And of course, the low level of support added to the burden of passing major change. Well, despite the president's efforts to address the public's misgiving in speeches and news conferences and town hall style meetings and interviews, the public simply didn't respond. Instead, it displayed a lack of support for Obama and what it perceived as his health care plan. This next table gives us a general sense of public opinion about it. I like this question in particular because it gives a no opinion option, and you'll see early, back in April of 2009, there's a lot of people who don't have opinion, which is quite a sensible response at that time. But you will also see that people began having opinions, and you'll see a couple of important trends. First, there was a substantial decrease in the percentage of the people with no opinion between April and July, when debates started heating up. Second, although support held steady, what actually happened is a substantial increase of 16 percentage points in opposition. So most of the people who began having opinions moved into the opposition camp. Now, we don't have a panel study, which would mean following the same person over time, that data isn't available, but it appears those who formed opinions during that time did indeed go into the opposition. Now, the next table shows the same kind of thing. This is by Pew, another very good public opinion operation, and you'll see similar kinds of problems for the president there, similar to the previous table. Now, if we disaggregate these results and we see that the support for health care was highly polarized. Few Republicans and Republican leaners in support, but worse for the president, 1/3 of Democrats and 45% of Democratic-leaning independents didn't support the bills. Only a third of independents supported the bill, although a solid majority had supported the principle of health care reform back in late 2008 at the time of the election. So you can see the president was up against it. It was quite a difficult time for him. What was even more frustrating for the president, and tells us a lot about the nature, the challenge of health care reform, the public favored a lot of the provisions advocated by the administration. The option of a public plan, one of the most controversial in the press, and one of the things that Republicans hated the most, was actually reasonably popular with the public and had clear majority support, the public option. Expanding government plans to cover low-income Americans, popular. Requiring insurance companies to cover everyone, regardless of pre-existing conditions, majority support. They liked it. And they liked a lot of ways for, there were options for paying for this, raising taxes on those making more than $280,000 a year, requiring employers to pay a fee if they didn't provide health care insurance, and offering tax credits to help some people pay for individual health care insurance. So it's quite interesting that people were against reform, but they were in favor of almost all the important parts of it. Goodness. But of course, it's the bottom line that's really going to matter. And the public's evaluations of the president's handling of health care mirrored the erosion of support for his proposals. As you see here, at least by June, Obama received less than a majority approval, and he never recovered. And the decrease here was particularly notable among independents. By August, a plurality of the public disapproved of the president's handling of health care, and majorities have continued to disapprove ever since. Now, of course, the ultimate goal of the White House's effort to obtain public support is to use it to move Congress. That's why they do all these things. That's why you have a bully pulpit. It's not just for self-gratification. It's to show Congress that the public wants change. Well, we can see here that the president wasn't successful. With the exception of the early October poll, there was always a slight plurality of the public who wanted their member of Congress to vote against health care reform. The table also shows there was no change in the advice the public would offer their member of Congress following the president's national address that we talked about in September. For seniors, the figures were the worst. And this, again, is one of the most difficult problems and maybe counterintuitive problems. Only 32% advised support and 42% opposed. Seniors were those most strongly opposed to health care reform. Well, those seniors, and I'm about to be one, I don't know when you officially become a senior, but I'm getting close, all right, were the ones who were benefiting the most from government health insurance at that time. The inability to reassure seniors was perhaps the greatest setback in the entire health care debate. Now, the results in these tables that I have been showing you reflect considerable stability in opinion, especially after the health care debate heated up in the summer of 2009. So once people had opinions, they weren't flip-flopping, they weren't moving. There was very little movement, despite all the president's efforts. And I've showed you that he made a lot of efforts. Partisanship, of course, is part of the answer. It appears that Republicans and Democrats reached decisions early and stuck to them. In addition, Americans focus more on the ideological underpinnings of health care reform than on the details. I've shown you that the public actually supported the details of health care reform, but the bottom line was negative. Supporters generally favored the law because they wanted to expand health care to the uninsured, and opponents just didn't want government touching policy. In fact, one of the most famous lines from the Tea Party rallies was, "Keep government's hands off my Medicare," which, if you know anything about public policy, if you've had one day in public policy, you know is an hilarious kind of statement, since Medicare is 100% government program. But nevertheless, that's what people thought. Now, there was another element here, and I said before that people are risk-averse, and they're particularly risk-averse about health care. So it's always a problem, and reassurance is always essential. And this brings us to the issue of misinformation, because probably the most frustrating aspect of this whole battle for the White House was the inability to clarify mistaken notions about the proposal, notions that were damaging the case. In the summer of 2009, Betsy McCaughey voiced the false claim that the health care legislation in Congress would result in seniors being directed to end their life sooner, as she put it. Well, you can imagine that this would not be a popular proposal. Numerous conservative pundits and Republican members of Congress quickly parroted her claim, including Rush Limbaugh, Glenn Beck, Sean Hannity, Fred Thompson, Laura Ingraham, the New York Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Times, and Fox News. The myth reached its peak after it was embellished by Sarah Palin, who, on her Facebook posting on August 7th, 2009, denounced government death panels. And thus came the famous phrase that became part of the discourse about health care reform, death panels. Now, Palin's comments created a media frenzy. In the 10 days after her initial statement, the Washington Post media critic Howard Kurtz found 18 mentions of death panels in the Post, 16 in the New York Times, and more than 150 on network and cable news. This was amazing. Now, you might think, in the best of all worlds anyhow, that those who are parroting these claims would actually look at the bills, because they are actually open to the public. You just have to look. But of course, they never did. By mid-August 2009, fully 86% of the public had heard about the death panels. Among those that heard about them, 50% said it's not true. That's the good news. But a sizable minority believed that the health care legislation would create such organizations, and another 20% didn't know. And when you don't know whether or not there's a death panel, guess how you feel about the whole bill? You're against it. Nearly half of Republicans were misinformed, as were 45% who reported regularly receiving their news from Fox News. Another mid-August poll found 45% of those surveyed believed the Democrats' bill would, and I quote, allow the government to make decisions about when to stop providing medical care to the elderly, a figure that rose to 75% amongst Fox News viewers. In mid-September, 26% of respondents still believed that health care legislation would create organizations to decide when to stop providing health care to the elderly, the so-called death panels. Despite an all-out effort by the Obama White House, which naturally was very concerned that people would believe such things, because that's obviously a knife in the heart of health care reform, 30% said the bill would use taxpayer money to provide health care benefits for illegal immigrants, despite the president specifically affirming on national TV that it would not. Even, and you're going to love this one, in July of this year, July, 41% of the public believed that the law allowed a government, the law that had passed, all right, that you can look up on the internet in approximately 10 seconds, right, to make decisions about end-of-life care for people on Medicare. An additional 16% said they didn't know. Well, this is what the president's up against. Complete, total falsehoods. There's no question about that. There is no such thing, no such things had ever been in the bill. Well, in January of this year, as the debate on health care reform was reaching its final stages, large segments of the bill, of the public, still were unaware of major elements of the Democrat proposal. And I've had to break this up into a couple of slides because there are many elements. And we have percent aware, so subtract that from 100 and you see the percent unaware. Only 59% of the public understood that most people could keep their employer-provided insurance if health care reform passed. Small businesses didn't know about subsidies for them. Seniors did not know the bill closed the donut hole on prescription drugs. And young adults did not know they could stay on their parents' health insurance policies until they were 26. Well, being risk-averse, hearing about, and I'll be happy to share the rest, rest of these later, because I know you can only read so fast. It is little wonder that many in the public opposed the president. On January 19th, on the president's 365th day in office, the White House received what appeared to be a severe setback in its efforts to pass health care reform. The president had traveled, taking his case to Massachusetts the previous weekend to campaign for Martha Coakley, the Democratic candidate to fill Teddy Kennedy's seat in the Senate. On Election Day, however, Republican Scott Brown won a decisive victory, leaving the Democrats one vote short of a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. The irony of Kennedy's replacement killing the chances of the Senate compromising with the House on major health care reform was coupled with the fact that the public in one of the most liberal and reliably Democratic states in the Union had rejected the president's plea for support. But the administration did not give up and kept looking for openings. The president held a televised summit that included congressional Republicans towards the end of February. But despite all of his and his administration's efforts, the president never obtained majority or even plurality support for health care reform. He could not create an opportunity for change, especially in the context of a severe recession and opposition to his policies for dealing with the recession, such as the stimulus bill. Public opposition to those policies, an inherent skepticism of government programs, and a complex policy that was difficult to explain, as you can see, and, as we have seen, easy to caricature, all worked against the president. Now, despite these, what I will call context-specific obstacles to leading the public that I've just mentioned here, we should not forget the general principle that the president cannot depend on winning public support for his initiatives, taking us back from health care for a moment to presidential leadership more broadly. Now, in the end, the president, as we know, did achieve an historic victory on health care reform. But one of the most notable aspects about this was that it was perhaps the least popular major domestic policy passed in the last 100 years. Not necessarily where you want to position yourself for a midterm election. A CBS New York Times poll taken right before the House voted to pass the Senate bill, the last day of this entire episode, in the late on the evening of March 21st of this year, only 37% of the public approved the bill. 48% opposed it. In the following months, since then, opinion has been stable and lacking majority support for the bill. The White House thought, well, once we pass it, the public will change its mind. At least that will change its mind. That doesn't happen. Moreover, the president's pursuit of health care legislation appears to be a major contribution to what most analysts expect to be a disastrous midterm election for Democrats this November, which, of course, would undermine the president's ability to govern in the rest of his term. It's a mistake for presidents to assume that they can lead the public. There's nothing in the historical record to support such belief. An analysis of FDR's efforts to lead the public into World War II found the public basically resisted these efforts. Detailed studies of Bill Clinton and Ronald Reagan, two of the greatest communicators we're likely to ever have, a Republican and a Democrat, at about the same point in American history, found that in almost all policies, public opinion moved against the president. And they rarely got majorities. We've seen just a little indicator of the problems that Clinton had on health care reform, but it's true across the board. Opinion typically moved against the president and was rarely a majority for the president. Ronald Reagan was less a public relations phenomena than the conventional wisdom indicates. He had the good fortune to take office on the crest of a compatible wave of public opinion. He effectively exploited the opportunity the voters had handed him, and that was good. That was effective leadership. But when it came time to change public opinion or even mobilize it in his behalf, he typically met with failure. As his press secretary, Marlin Fitzwater, put it, and this is Reagan's press secretary, Reagan would go out on the stump, draw huge throngs, and convert no one at all. That's the great communicator. Well, presidents, even skilled presidents, can transform the political landscape to pave the way for change by leading the public. Strategies for governing premised on substantially increasing public support for policy proposals are prone to failure. Presidential power is not the power to persuade. Now, I think the stakes of understanding this are especially high for the presidents themselves. Because presidents aren't in strong positions to create opportunities for legislative success, recognizing those that already exist is particularly significant. Indeed, it may be the most significant skill of all. But it's very difficult to analyze the prospects for change. But we do know that the adoption of a core governing strategy of changing opinion, based on a belief of the presidential persuasiveness, may encourage presidents to underestimate their opponents and eschew necessary compromises in the mistaken belief that they can get the public on their side. Presidents and the country often endure self-inflicted wounds when they fail to appreciate the limits of their political influence. And in the process, the White House may suffer significant opportunity costs as it overlooks less dramatic but more realistic opportunities for success. Let me, in just a couple of minutes, give you 3 quick examples. One of the most famous incidents in American history is FDR's court packing plan. In February 1937, shortly after his greatest electoral victory, a great landslide, at the height of his powers, FDR surprised the nation, surprised many in his own administration, by proposing a plan to increase the Supreme Court. His motivation, of course, was transparent. He wanted to add members who would support New Deal policies. It is telling that after the election, the president was so confident of his public support and his ability to channel its support behind his initiatives that he didn't do his normal consulting with major elements in his coalition. Well, however we interpret the White House's success, and of course he did not succeed in increasing the court, there's little doubt that the entire episode was a costly one for the president. As one of the leading historians of the New Deal put it, never again would FDR be as predominant either on Capitol Hill or at the polling place as he was when 1937 began. The court battle became a rallying point around which latent opposition to the New Deal could coalesce, the beginning of the conservative coalition. It held well together a bipartisan coalition of anti-New Deal senators. The battle over the court deeply divided the Democratic Party, precipitating factional wars in the states, and that didn't help. As a result, the court struggle helped to blunt the most important drive for social reform in American history and squandered the advantage of Roosevelt's great triumph in 1936. Let's go up to Bill Clinton for a minute. We know what happened, and we know the president greatly overestimated his power to move public opinion. Now, you might think that there may be a lesson that he would learn there, but that's not the lesson he learned. Indeed, the premise of the power of the presidential pulpit was so strong that each downturn in the bill's progress prompted new schemes for going public, rather than a reconsideration of the fundamental framework of the bill or the basic strategy for obtaining its passage. Now, ultimately, the president concluded that health care reform failed because, and I quote, "I totally neglected how to get the public informed. I have to get more involved in crafting my message and getting across my core concerns." Barack Obama said very similar things earlier this year about health care reform. In other words, it wasn't that the strategy was inappropriate, only his implementation of it. The premise of the potential of presidential persuasion seems to be non-falsifiable, because clear and systematic failure just cannot be taken as evidence that it doesn't work. In the 1994 midterm elections, the Democrats lost majority in both the House and the Senate for the first time in 4 decades. The administration's health care proposal was the prime example of the Republicans charged with the Democrats were ideological extremists who'd lost touch with the wishes of Americans. George W. Bush won election in 2004. We can have a little battle later whether it was election or re-election, but anyhow, it doesn't matter. He was elected in 2004. He was very happy. He got the most votes. And the Republicans said, you know, we're ready. We're going to keep together this fantastic campaign organization that we just put together, and indeed it was, and we're now going to turn it to serve the president's initiatives. And the president said, well, you know, the biggest public policy in America is Social Security, and we need to reform it because it's a looming problem. And they launched what was probably the largest and best organized public relations effort in the history of the world to sell a policy. And you may recall that you could actually trace this on the Treasury Department's website. It started out as 60 stops in 60 days. The president went to town hall meetings all across the country. He sent high-level administration officials all across the country. Turned out there was more than 60 stops in more than 60 days because it wasn't working. At any rate, the public did not respond to the president's plan. Indeed, the longer the president talked, the worse he got. Instead, what really happened was that the president's efforts reinforced a growing perception, fair or unfair, and we can talk about that later, that he wasn't up to the job. It was the beginning of the unveiling of Republican cohesiveness in Congress. It was the end, the effective end of the Bush administration, and it was in the first year of his second term. Now, Roosevelt, Clinton, and Bush overestimated the prospects for change. In these cases, the president's assumption that he could achieve his goals through persuasion led to much greater problems than the failure to achieve the immediate goal. It also weakened each administration in the long term. Barack Obama is following in their well-worn footsteps. The dangers of overreach and debilitating political losses ought to alert us, I think, that it's critically important for presidents to assess accurately the potential of obtaining public support. And the success of a strategy for governing depends upon the opportunity to succeed. Adopting strategies of governing that are prone to failure waste opportunities rather than creating them. It is a recipe for failure. Why do presidents overreach? Well, it's quite natural that presidents, basking in the glow of their electoral success, want to focus on creating rather than exploiting opportunities. They want to create opportunities. They can take their case to the people. They're accustomed to taking their cases to the people. They've been doing it for years. That's how you get to be president in the first place, right? And somebody emerges as a winner, and they like to think that it's because they were so persuasive. And their victors reinforce their proclivities for believing in their own persuasiveness. They want to believe that the public has chosen them and what they stand for, not that the public rejected the other contenders or simply voted with the party. But as we saw with Harry Truman, campaigning is not governing. Now, other politicians who obtain their jobs by campaigning reinforce the tendencies of presidents to believe in the power of persuasion. For example, one of the most common criticisms of Barack Obama right now, including among Democrats, by the way, is failing to offer a convincing narrative of his administration. These critics often refer wistfully to the success of Ronald Reagan in doing so and weathering a recession. We had a severe recession in 1982. Misremembering the past is a common malady for politicians, especially those who see themselves in electoral trouble and are eager for a political lifeline. In fact, Reagan didn't fare well with the public during the recession. He first fell below 50% approval in his 11th month in office. In the first year. Except for one poll after that, he remained below 50% for the next 2 years. For 2 more years. His approval reached a nadir of 35% approval in January of 1983. This is the great communicator now. And this is the model that some people want to hold up to Barack Obama, saying, why can't you be like Reagan? Presumably Obama, who's at 46%, would say, all things being equal, I'd rather not. Of course, presidents could overreach for other reasons. They're in office for such a short time that it's difficult to think about husbanding resources or sequencing proposals. There may be no tomorrow. And they've campaigned and made a lot of promises, and their supporters expect them to keep their promises. Well, whatever the reason for overreach, going public or governing by campaigning is problematic. It's unlikely to work, and it may have disastrous consequences. Now, let me conclude by asking a couple of questions. If persuasion is problematic, is compromise an option? In the context of polarized politics, meaning great differences between the two sides, Democrats and Republicans, might presidents conclude that they can't govern by adopting an inclusive orientation to policymaking and reaching out to a diminishing middle of the electorate? Similarly, do the limitations on presidential persuasion inevitably create incentives to polarize politics itself, to go out and polarize the public, to mobilize your base in the feeling that you have no chance of getting anyone else to support you? Well, it's difficult to answer such questions. It'll take us a while. We do know, however, that there's a widespread desire to change basic features of our politics, including the tendency for civility to lose out to conflict, for deadlock to trump compromise, for deliberation to succumb to sound bites, for legislative product to yield to campaign issues, and for public confidence to surrender to public cynicism. A richer understanding of the true potential of leadership is a critical step in addressing these characteristics of contemporary politics. Thank you.
Past Sunday's episode of 60 Minutes, when Jimmy Carter came out and said Ted Kennedy, despite him, destroyed the health care bill before it can get through the committee. Do you think that's necessarily true, or do you think that Kennedy might have been overly concerned that Jimmy Carter lacked those skills to try to sell his health care plan to people, given his low approval ratings and his inability to persuade anybody?
Yeah. Well, I don't know exactly what Kennedy's motivation was. And there are different ways to interpret even the same actions. But given the difficulties that President Carter had with many other bills, it's highly unlikely that it would have passed. It's quite convenient. I like Jimmy Carter. I've spent time with Jimmy Carter. I actually have, I think I'm the only scholar who's ever had the opportunity to just interview him and anything I wanted to ask. He's a very smart guy. He's also a guy who's very interested in how he's perceived. Of course, has no love for Ted Kennedy, because Ted Kennedy ran a very effective primary campaign against him in 1980, which of course helped split the Democratic Party and certainly hurt Carter's chances for re-election. That's the best answer that I can tell you, but I don't think that it's likely that we would have had it if the two had combined. I think that we've already seen the difficulties that you have in healthcare reform. It's so complex, it's so big, people are so risk averse, there's so much misinformation. And the way you defeat healthcare traditionally, from Harry Truman complaining about the AMA calling it socialized medicine, and as the word socialized, that labeling it, same thing, same techniques were used against Medicare. Even now, when Barack Obama got almost the entire healthcare industry on his side, it still got labeled, and there was still very substantial efforts. And then there was this misinformation. I don't mean to say that everyone who passed on word about the death panels was knowingly lying, but they were completely irresponsible in not actually checking. And then when it was perfectly clear within days that there were no such things, there was never any such things, nor did anybody ever want any such things, they continued to talk about them. So the same kind of problems were still there, and they would have been there in the late 1970s.
Let me go ahead and ask you a question.
Okay.
Follow along that. So you do talk with former presidents and presidents. Had Obama called you for advice at some point before he got this far?
Yeah.
And said, George, how, you've studied problems of persuasion. What do you recommend that I do? What's the best approach I can take?
Okay.
What advice would you give?
That's an interesting question. And it's one that I've thought about a bit. And there are two major elements to this. The first element is, how much can you get through at any given time? The president came into office, and he quite rightly said, I've got to deal with the economy. We've got to deal with this. Now, before he even became president, he had to ask to release the second half of the TARP funds, and so right away there's a battle. It's very unpopular, but I got to tell you, every grown-up I know I'm using this symbolically grown up. We had to do this. We had to, despite the fact that we all hate Wall Street, we hate the bankers, you know, they're unworthy. All of it's true. Or we'd had a financial calamity beyond anything that we could imagine. At any rate, he felt the same thing that George W. Bush and the Republican administration felt. We have to do this. And then he said, we've got a really serious recession ahead of us. And so I want to stimulate. Now, I don't know what the proper amount is to stimulate the economy. But everyone was going to spend hundreds of billions of dollars. I mean, John McCain had a bill for about $500 billion, and we ended up with an $800 billion. I don't know. But at any rate, he felt he had to do it. And we're still trying to figure out what are all the consequences. It's a difficult question just to know in empirical fashion what the consequences were, political rhetoric aside, which is generally nonsense. At any rate, he felt he had to do it. To do that cost a lot of political capital, made a lot of people nervous, and spent a lot of money. And people got more and more nervous. And the whole Tea Party movement, for example, is really focused on fiscal matters, fiscal conservatism. So you could say, and indeed this was my general advice, you could say, well, look, here's what I think you need to do. You need to just focus on that, show people that you're on top, you know, that this is their major concern is the economy, not health care, but the economy. Focus on that, nurture your majority along, you know, hit the midterm elections, you know, and a stronger position rather than a weaker one. And then, and don't worry so much about trying to get those few Republicans, because you're not going to get any Republican support anyhow. No matter what you do, it's irrelevant. No, they're not going to support any major policy, and they haven't. And so I separate yourself from the last administration. That's a view. If there was someone, senior person from the Obama administration here right now to say, look, this was the only chance we will ever have to pass health care reform. We got big majorities. We're unlikely to ever have it again. We have big majorities because we won all of the competitive seats in the last two elections. And what is going to happen in November is that Republicans will probably win most of them back. But they're the swing seats. The Democrats now have a lot of seats that they either ought not to have. By say ought, I mean in terms of what is the real division of opinion in those districts, and they were just fed up with Bush. So this was it. Now, this means, of course, my response, you've mortgaged your entire administration to health care reform, which could be defunded if the Republicans do well in the midterm election. So you can go back and forth, and it's very difficult. Now, that's one aspect of it. But you see, it's a difficult strategic decision. The other pillar here is, can you do health care? You know, it's so complex. And I said, so people, as I showed you, people didn't know what was in it. They didn't know lots of things. And when asked individually, do you like this kind of thing? They say, yeah, I like it. I like it. Yeah, please, that's wonderful. That's great. So they liked almost everything in it, but they didn't like it. Okay, so what if you just focus? And so you just say, well, here's some real popular things. You know, pre-existing conditions. No, you can't have any, you know, no more of that. Everyone's for that. You know, everyone is for that. You can stay on your parents' health insurance for longer. Because the people who are least likely to have health insurance are which group of people? Young people. And who are most likely to use hospital emergency rooms? Young people. And who pays for all that? All the rest of us. So, you know, and at any rate, but here's the problem. Here's the rub. And that's why, you know, Clinton had this huge bill that the opponents made fun of, and this is a huge bill. It's always huge bills, and there's the rub. The only way to get health insurance companies you know, not running the Harry and Louise ads against you, but running them for you, is to give them 30 million new customers. And the only way to get these lovely things that I was just talking about is to give them 30 million customers, which means that you've got to have the big expense because you're reaching out to the uninsured. So you've got to do it comprehensively or you can't do it at all. That's the rub. Now, so someday, maybe somebody can figure out a way to get around that problem. One way we've done things, you know, that it used to be called the S-chip program, now it's called the CHIPS program, and Congress has been adding more and more children under that to extend health care to children. It's a way. And we've done more and more under Medicaid, not Medicare, but Medicaid, and extended that. But it's become very, very expensive, and of course states are quite resistant because they don't have enough money to pay for this great university and other important public services. So it's very hard to figure out how to do it in a piecemeal fashion where you don't irritate so many people, you know, and you can just do things that are wildly popular. So it's a conundrum. It's a conundrum, and I don't have this. I don't have the solution to that particular conundrum, nor do I know that anyone who does. And maybe there are experts in the audience on healthcare, and maybe you do. And please write the White House. They may need to hear from you.
And I heard you say that FDR didn't put general health insurance for everyone. Let that out to get some security. And then it never really came before Clinton announced we've got this thing. Now, maybe that we don't know what the future is going to hold, but at least from the historical perspective, it looks like we've got some kind of success here. We've got something.
Historic, I mean, this is clearly historic legislation. There's no doubt about it. We'll have to see what happens in the next 2 years to see whether it actually takes hold or doesn't take hold, and what the Republicans are able to do and what they're inclined to do. So it is historic. And the question, but how it came about is not how the White House expected it to come about. And actually, about 2 weeks into the Obama presidency, I was doing a show which happens to be recorded on C-SPAN. Not a big audience, but it's recorded, and that's the point, so I'm not making this up. And I predicted that the president, despite his communicative skills, would not be able to mobilize the public, would not be able to mobilize his supporters even, would not get any bipartisan support, and to the extent that he had successes, would ram things through in a party line vote. Because that's what happens in polarized politics in America today, Democrats and Republicans alike. And that's exactly what's happened. That's exactly, and that is the only way things will happen. So it goes back, this takes me back to where I tried to begin answering Dale's question. What if he just recognized that in the first place? And instead of spending all those months trying to win Grassley's vote, or Susan Collins or Olympia Snowe in particular, virtually lived at the White House, it seems, you know, I mean, but you could not get any. You couldn't get the votes at all. I mean, not one. And so you drag it out and drag it out and drag it out. And meanwhile, it's more and more unpopular as you're dragging it out, and there's more misinformation, and people are becoming more and more irritated. What if he just said, look, we'll have a debate, we'll debate it for 2 months, and then, by God, you know, we were elected, this is what we're promised to do, and we're going to do it. And if you don't like it then, vote against us, you know, a year and a half from now. But that's not what they did. Thinking that, well, we can convince people, and then it'll be a popular thing, and, you know, and we'll have bipartisan support and all these wonderful things. So it strikes me that, you know, it's time to reassess some fundamental things about politics, and that requires us, and I know there's politics students here, you understand politics and you apply it. And it's quite interesting. You know, I began to say those who are most likely to make these mistakes are politicos who you think would know the most about it. And, you know, they're in the White House, for God's sakes, you know. I mean, they're pretty smart people, and they just had great political success. I mean, they won the big prize. And yet they're completely wrong. And they say things that are just completely wrong. They don't understand. And it becomes non-falsifiable to them. They can't readjust. It's one of the fascinating things about politics, and particularly high-level politics, that keeps me going, to try to explain why these kinds of things happen with really smart people and who mean well. Yeah. Any other?
I understand you say that it's impossible for a president or not necessarily that last part, at least finding their fears and digging into those. So should the president's try to govern using that insight?
Occasionally they have, but no, I don't recommend it because I don't think it leads to positive developments. I mean, I don't think it leads to reforms that we may need. I mean, let's just take something that's got to be reformed. We all know that entitlements have to be reformed. It's all fine to talk about the discretionary budget, you know, which is a little tiny portion of the domestic discretionary budget. Anybody who knows anything about the budget, it's a tiny thing. Even if you eliminate it tomorrow afternoon, every penny, no FBI, you know, no air traffic controllers, nothing, you'd have a huge budget deficit. And that's not an arguable point. That's clearly, unequivocally true. So you could scare people in theory by saying, we're going to run out of money. You know, we're going to run out of money for Medicare, just zooming costs. We don't have the money, you know. But we hear talk about it, but I don't know that ever, you know, we've been talking about it forever. And George W. Bush said, well, I want to reform this. People didn't like his particular reform, but he said, you know, it doesn't seem to work. It doesn't seem to lead people to want to do what needs to be done, which is either you got to cut back on benefits or you got to raise taxes. You got to do one or the other or some combination. But it's pretty, you know, the range of options is understandable. So I'm not sure it leads to so we have to do something about this. That's neither a conservative or a liberal statement. I think everyone agrees we have to do something about it. But I don't see fear helping the cause. It usually just makes people so risk-averse they don't want to do anything. We tried to use this Franklin Roosevelt in I think an acceptable way about World War II. And he could not get the public on his side. I mean, big events in Europe moved public opinion, but Roosevelt could not with his speeches, and he was always getting out front, having to backtrack, and getting out front, having to backtrack again, because he said it's a terrible thing. You know, you get out in front, you say, and you look around, no one's following you. It's a terrible thing for a leader. Yeah, you're out on a limb and someone's sawing it off. You know, and you know, fear. I mean, if you're not afraid of Hitler, who are you going to be afraid of? It doesn't seem to be a positive element. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
What would you think about the idea of humility? And I'm talking from George Bush to Barack Obama to a lot of it seems like when they found out they had the majority, once they became president, then you use that bully pulpit. What if you backed off and took the humble approach and let the Congress fight themselves? And then would the president have any more power over both parties and something like that?
No, it's again an interesting question. One of the things that White Houses are always learning or sometimes mislearning lessons from the past. So the Obama White House said, you know, we saw Bill Clinton, he sent down, you know, Hillary had this big commission, and they sent down this bill to Congress and said, pass it. And that didn't work. So what we're going to do is send down some basic goals, and we'll let them do it. But of course, what this means is you got delay, you got big battles, you know, I mean, it just stretches things out. I don't think there's a perfect answer to that, but president clearly needs to be in there leading, or you get messes. On the stimulus bill, one of the things that hurt the president in his first big bill was the stimulus bill. It was right away. It was passed in February of 2009. And one of the things that the White House said is we need about this amount, because that's what the economists say we need to stimulate the economy. And Congress can figure it out. So what happened was that the Democrats, who are now in charge with the nice majority, put everything they always wanted to do, you know, and could do, at least short-term expenditure, in there. And then it gave the Republicans some justifiable basis for saying, well, this isn't a very good idea, and this is going to be wasteful and whatever. So that colors the whole thing. And in some ways, it doesn't matter what you spend money as long as people spend it, because you're supposed to stimulate the economy, which means put some money in people's hands and let them give it to somebody else, who will then give it to somebody else, and that's how you stimulate the economy. That's, when you let Congress loose for a moment, and that was even at the beginning. We let them loose and see they screwed up, and the White House didn't want wasteful things or unattractive things in there. So I think there must be a middle ground, but I think it's impossible to articulate it ahead of time. But you can't just turn it over to Congress, or you're going to have problems.
Is it persuading the public? Where are they getting their opinions from?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think it's becoming more and more concern. The public gets its opinions from what it sees around it, and which is a very sensible way. People are generally sensible. And so, historic events, the nature of the economy, and whatever they say, this is a problem or this is not, they have some sense about those things. But what has now happened is that we have niche media. Sometimes it's a big niche. And that means that people go for reinforcement. And, the internet was supposed to, and cable and all that, was supposed to give everybody so much information, and it was going to be fantastic. And there is a great deal of information, but it allows people to go to exactly who they agree with. And so they're likely to hear, so they're not being challenged. And if you have, and there really is no comparable media. The right has done a fantastic job with the media. Almost all the political radio talk shows are conservative. And maybe there's fewer liberals than there are conservatives to begin with, but maybe those on the left just don't like to listen to those kind of shows. I don't know, but they never seem to work. There's nothing comparable to Fox News on the other side. It's just simply nonsensical to say it's CNN. That is ridiculous. It's a ridiculous statement. And I just threw in a couple of pieces of information that those who watch Fox News were widely misinformed about basic facts. We also found that about weapons of mass destruction and the finding of weapons of mass destruction. And who are those who are most likely to be in Iraq? Who are most likely to be misinformed about that? People who watch Fox News. Of all the news sources, they were the most likely to be. Now, it's not that the accurate fact was never presented on Fox News. I don't mean that. I don't mean to say that. In some parts of Fox News, was just perfectly fine. But at any rate, the niche media, the reinforcement, it becomes an echo chamber, and it's a real problem to get through for a president a president of any party to get through to the American people to try to make a case. And as you can see, another thing that's happened as a result of media, but it's just the existence of the media, not actually what the media actually does. It used to be that if a president wanted to speak to the American people, and they wouldn't do it very often, everybody had to listen if you watch TV, because there was only 3 networks, and all the networks carried it, right? One of the things, and we can easily trace because Nielsen does it, so we have excellent data on this, falling ratings for presidents. And it's attributable to cable TV, because all you have to do is press a button and you're watching what's Worldwide Wrestling Foundation, whatever it is. I'm not an aficionado at this, but anyhow, anything you want. You can watch. There's 100 other options or more for anybody, and most people actually take those options. So audiences for presidents are much smaller than as a percentage of the population than they used to be. It's really hard to get through. And you can see how much misinformation or unawareness. Sometimes people, and it's really interesting, when people are wrong about something, they actually, it almost reinforces their belief. They believe it even more strongly when they believe there's a death panel. And you just can't convince them that there's not, you know, and the complete absence of evidence that there is doesn't matter. This is psychological study. It's got nothing to do with, you know, liberal or conservative politics. It's just how people are, how they're wired. So it's a real problem once that gets through to people, once they have it in their heads. I give lots of talks in big audiences, and you're talking, you know, I'm not advocating health care or one way or the other. And I have people on Medicare, and they ask me about it. I said, well, it's just not there. You know, that's not true. And I said, you can look it up, but they're never going to look it up, right? It's available. They could go. I could do it on just a minute here on the computer that my hands are on right now, but they will never look it up, and all they have to do is be worried, and that's all they need. You know, it's a problem. It's a real problem, I think.
Well, we thank our guest before we send him off tonight with our applause. So thank you so much for coming.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.